someone who glazes over when you start reading the terms and conditions of something that you're expected to sign? Medical consent, credit card application, something to let you go ahead with the internet shopping. If so, you might not like historical wills very much, but bear with me, they can be more interesting than they look. They were often written in that old-fashioned, official-sounding formal language, which can be quite difficult to get on with in the early 21st century. Rather than say something like "my son John" all the way through, the will might include phrases like "my said son John" whenever John comes up in the document, just in case somebody accidentally gets the impression that the person who's making the will had two sons called John. Although that's not as strange as you might think. My great-great-great-great-granddad certainly did have two sons called John, so not impossible, just a bit strange. But get beyond the archaic phrasing, and an ancestor's will offer an awful lot of insight into how they lived. The trouble is, not everybody made a will before they died. Some people maybe just didn't have time. Maybe your ancestor is one of those unfortunates who was accidentally killed by a cart. They didn't have time. Other people probably didn't own anything of any real value. They might have had the tools that they worked with. They probably rented their cottage. They maybe had a few clothes that would get handed out between the family anyway. Nothing worth writing down in an organised fashion on a piece of paper. In that case, it would just be pointless to write a will. Sometimes an ancestor does leave a will, and quite frankly, it is so vague as to be used for other wills. They can answer questions that you never knew you needed to ask. They're the ones I'm going to talk about today, because they're the ones that are fun. So let's look at two examples of how you can use a surviving will to learn a bit more about your ancestors. So I'm going to start by taking you back to the village of Golborne in Lancashire. It's near Haydock Park, where the racecourse is. It's about 12 miles from Liverpool, 18 from Manchester. And the date today is the 14th of May, 1763. We're in the reign of George III. My 6 times great-grandfather, Ralph Leigh, formerly a tanner but now a gentleman, is writing his will. And this is what it tells us. He and his wife Marjorie were still married, so he very kindly invites her to take so many of my goods, cattle, chattels, household stuff and furniture as she shall make her choice of and think proper to take. So he's given her a free run on the furniture. With 2 caveats. He's not being too liberal. The goods should not exceed £50 in value, and if Marjorie should decide that she wants to remarry, then she has to give all of those items that she's taken to her son James, who is her eldest child with Ralph, which is quite a standard sort of thing. As it happened, Marjorie did live on for 24 years after Ralph. She never did remarry, but when you actually look at the terms of Ralph's will and what he offered her, I think maybe she knew a good deal when she saw one. She was allowed the liberty of living in, using, occupying and enjoying one parlour with a room over the same, with the privilege of the garden and orchard for fruit and herbs for her use only. So she can't actually sell any of the produce that is grown on his property, but she can take as much as she likes for her own consumption. That's not a bad deal. And actually, in saying all that, Ralph has inadvertently told us that he lives in a 2-storey house, and we even know what he's growing in his garden, so that's an incidental comment that tells you a little more than you knew you were going to find out. Now, you don't have to look too far into the will before you realise that Ralph Leigh was a man of property. He lived at Golborne, and he definitely had 2 messuages and tenements there. A messuage is just a residential house. Usually it's got some outbuildings, there might be a bit of land, more or less equivalent to your modern house with a garden and maybe a garage, maybe a shed. He's got another 2 of these at Lowton and another 2 with some extra land in neighbouring villages of Kenyon and Parr. He's got a cottage at Lowton and also another place there he mentions called Seddon House. So he is clearly a man of property. Where some people in their will don't bother to specifically mention their children by name, Ralph went to the other extreme. He'd had 16 children with Marjorie, and 11 of them are still alive in 1763 when he makes his will. Some of them are still just children. And he actually mentions James, Margaret, Marjorie, Mary, Jane, Richard, Robert, Thomas and Ralph. There's a mouthful. So that's 9 of the 11. He even goes as far as to make a specific provision for his daughter-in-law Sarah, who was married to Thomas, and goes on to say that there was actually a marriage settlement drawn up between them, so she probably had a bit of money settled on her by her dad when she got married, a kind of a dowry. That gives you an idea of the social class that Ralph was part of. However, there are a few things that Ralph doesn't talk about that other people did mention in their wills. He doesn't talk about anything like trinkets, personal effects. We don't know whether he's got a set of 12 silver tablespoons in his kitchen. We don't know if he's got pictures on the wall. But there is one interesting little extra. So the material things maybe didn't mean so much to him, but the things that were symbols of social status certainly did. His younger sons, Ralph and Richard, are given explicit permission to sit in the pew that he has at Lowton Church, which is probably where the family worships. But they weren't allowed to do this until they were 21 years old. And when the will was made, Richard, however, was nearly 20 and Ralph 17 and a half, so they didn't have too long to wait. But in all of this, you may, if you've been paying attention, have noticed something. I said Ralph had 11 children, and I've only named 9 of them. Well, Ellen and Alice, his daughters, don't get a look in on this will. They're not even mentioned. And I suspect this is actually because both of them were married and already had children, I think, when he made the will. If he had left them anything, it would automatically become the property of their husbands. So his way around that, I imagine, would have been to settle money or land or jewellery or whatever was appropriate on them in the form of a marriage settlement when they were married. When you start to look into all these things, marriage settlements, which sound very upper class and very organised, formal, when you put all the pieces together, you get quite a good impression of the life that Ralph Leigh lived. I think he lived very comfortably, and that his widow, Marjorie, probably had a very comfortable widowhood. She probably just knew a good thing when she saw it. But by a strange, weird coincidence, I found a will for another 6 times great-granddad, and he lived not too far away from our friend Ralph Leigh. Josephhurst was a shoemaker and leather cutter in Ormskirk, Lancashire. When you look at the structure of wills, you very quickly realise that of course they're being made by people who are in their final months of life, or maybe just want to get things arranged for the time when they do die, and so it's entirely natural that they would be thinking about what happens to them after they're gone. So, like many people, Joseph dealt with the most important thing first. My soul I humbly recommend to the mercy of Almighty God, and I desire that my body may be interred in the churchyard at Ormskirk. Now the churchyard in Ormskirk is attached to the Anglican Church. Joseph himself was a Roman Catholic, so it sounds a bit strange that he is specifically asking to be buried in the wrong churchyard, but at the time there wasn't a right churchyard because there was only a Catholic chapel, there was no attached graveyard. If he lived in Ormskirk, there was only one place he was going to be buried. And most importantly, his late wife Margaret and I think a couple of his children were also buried in the Anglican graveyard, so of course he wanted to go there and be with them. Next we have the sum of £20 unto my granddaughter Margaret, now or formerly Margaret Walmsley. This was the first I'd ever heard of this Margaret Walmsley. And what's interesting is that he's saying now or formerly, so it sounds like he's not quite sure whether Margaret is married or not. Maybe she doesn't live close enough for him to see her regularly. As it turned out, by this point she had in fact married her. She was living in the Walton Dale near Preston, not too far away, but far enough away for it to be a decent journey. Like Ralph Leigh, he then looked into his property. My tenement, cottage, hereditaments and premises situate in Burscough in the said county. I said it was very legal, this wills business. Unto my son-in-law, Thomas Spencer, now Helen or Ellen Hurst, had been born in the spring of 1773, and I did indeed find a marriage between her and a wheelwright named Thomas Spencer in 1799 at St Paul's Church in Liverpool. And after both have died, he then gives and devises the same, i.e. same cottages, to my said son John Hurst and his heirs and assigns for and during my estate's term. So he's obviously renting this property for a fixed number of years. He wants to make sure that his family use it while they're able to. So wills are good like that. As it turns out, Joseph had a bit of foresight there. Helen died in 1837, her husband Thomas Spencer died in 1849, and both were actually survived by Helen's brother, John Hurst. He actually made it to the age of 83, dying in 1854. I think he lived like the third longest of all of his brothers and sisters. He did really well. But of course Joseph didn't know that that was going to happen, so he put an extra clause in. And in case my said son John shall happen to die in the lifetime of the said Thomas Spencer and my daughter Ellen, again wordy, then I give and devise the same cottage hereditaments and so on unto my grandson Joseph, the son of my said son John, and his heirs. So we know that Joseph is the son of John, probably named after the man who's making the will. I'm a direct descendant of that John and that Joseph. John married Elizabeth Owen, but his father's will revealed that by 1818 John had married for the second time to Nancy. There's something else I didn't know. So that was the cottage in Burscough. But like Ralph Leigh, Joseph also had a couple of other properties. Some land in Simmonswood, and this land did well enough that he could promise John, his son, an annuity of £4 a year and another £6 annuity for his daughter Mary, so that's not too bad. And this piece of land is left to two of his friends, James Fletcher and William Gradwell. Gradwell is definitely a name that comes up in the Ormskirk Catholic records. James and William get this property for 20 years only, on the condition that they have to raise £40. After that, the property will go to Joseph's eldest son, George. And sure enough, by the time the first census is taken, George is still alive, and all these clauses and terms have expired. So sure enough, who's living at that property in 1841? But Joseph's son George. From the will, we even know where Joseph lived himself. 1818, he would have been about 77 years old by then. He's had a good long life. He's been widowed a long time. Naturally, he wants some company. He has this cottage in Orton Street in Ormskirk, which is one of the main streets in the town centre, which is occupied by me and William Moorcroft. So we even know exactly what street he lived in. And it sounds as though he had a flatmate, housemate, whatever you want to call him. And I'm quite pleased about that. His wife Margaret had died 18 years earlier. I think it's quite nice that he wasn't on his own. So after he's dealt with all the property and the big stuff, Joseph then takes the time to do something that Ralph Leigh didn't. He starts to go through the personal items that he has. We cannot get very much more personal than the clothing that we put on our own beds. I give and bequeath to my said daughter Mary Hearsnit my best bed, bed stocks and hangings. So has he got bed curtains? With one feather bed, one feather bolster, 2 pairs of sheets, 1 pair of blankets and 1 quilt. They might not have had central heating in 1818, but I really don't think Joseph was cold at night. The other daughter, Helen, got a similar share of bedding. All my books I give unto my son George and my daughter Mary. So that tells me that not only was Joseph literate, he'd have to be literate if he's got books, but his son George and his daughter Mary at the very least must have been literate, and probably some of his other children were as well. Really, literacy would be essential to him. He's a shoemaker, he's probably keeping business records, he's writing bills for customers, or maybe he's just making a note that Mr. Maudsley or whoever had brought his leather shoes in to be re-heeled. At the time, Ormskirk was something of a centre for clockmaking. From other people I've spoken to, that there's a lot of Ormskirk clocks out there. Understandably, Joseph wanted something to tell the time. And I think telling the time must have been very important to him, because he says, "I give and bequeath unto my grandson William, son of my son George, my old clock, to my grandson Joseph, also son of George, my watch." He's got a clock and a watch. The trouble with families like Joseph's is that they often like to name new babies after the baby's grandparents. In fact, that's exactly what Joseph's sons and daughters did. So Joseph had to be really specific about which grandson he actually means. One branch of the family ends up getting some really, really personal items. We've just spoken about one grandson, Joseph, but we also know that Joseph the elder had a son John who had a son called Joseph, and old Joseph leaves to his son John his clothing and wearing apparel, and also one feather bed, one pair of sheets, pair of blankets, quilt, bolster. There are some notable exceptions to the clothing that he gives to John. It's basically everything in the wardrobe, but unto my grandson Josephhurst, son of John, my new clocks, I don't know if it's clocks or cloaks actually, top coat and best red waistcoat. Now, Josephhurst is 77 years old. He's 1818, so this is the very, very end of the reign of George III. This is essentially the Regency period. So I wish I knew what that best red waistcoat looked like. Did he wear it to church on Sunday? Was it fashionable enough that his grandson would have wanted to wear it? Would he have just kept it as a keepsake? Who knows? But it is so fun to think of him having that in the wardrobe. So these two wills, made by my 6 times great grandfathers, both show a lot of insight into two men who had connections to the leather industry. They're both living in southwest Lancashire. Now, Ralph Leigh called himself a gentleman, and his will does indeed reflect that status. You would expect a gentleman to have his own pew to sit in at the local church. He goes into all this detail about his properties and who his tenants are. Again, you'd expect a gentleman to rent his land out to other people. That kind of thing is really useful in building up a picture of his life and his associates and his social status and the names of his wife and his numerous children. There were a lot. We even learn about his house. We know he had a parlour and at least one room above. It's a 2-storey house. It's got a garden, it's got an orchard. But as far as things that he had, in his house, like this, he's a lot more general. He just doesn't really mention personal stuff like that. Whereas Josephhurst also supplies all kinds of detail about his children and in-laws and even grandchildren, to the point of saying which grandchild belongs to which child. Very, very useful, and well done for that, Joseph. You've helped me immensely with the family tree there. The specific instructions that it gives about certain properties being left to certain friends for certain amounts of time, and then it goes to somebody else, and it's got to raise a certain amount of money, and somebody has got to get £5 a year, suggests that this is something that he'd really thought about. He planned it. He might have even consulted a solicitor about putting it together. I think he probably understood investments every bit as well as Ralph Leigh did. But he was also really concerned about making sure that his personal possessions went to the people that he wanted them to go to. It was important to him that, for instance, his grandson Joseph got the best red waistcoat. Well, you can also deduce things about where he lived. We know that he had a cottage on Lowton Street in the middle of Ormskirk. He left 3 of his children a bed each, which implies that there is either one great big bedroom where everybody sleeps in his house, or that it had 3 bedrooms. So there's 2 possibilities for you. We know that, best of all, if we had looked inside his wardrobe, we would have found a top coat and the famous best red waistcoat. It's just something personal that I really didn't expect to find. What really baffles me, however, is that in his younger years he was a shoemaker. He wasn't a shoemaker by the time he made the will, but nowhere does he mention any shoes, so we'll just take that as a given. So as you can see, no 2 wills are ever going to be alike, but what they will tell you is an awful lot about the person who made them and what was important to them. Different things are important to different people. This talk has actually looked at wills made by men but women did make wills too. So at some point in the future I'm going to look into the female side of wills, things that I have found not just through researching my own ancestors but also through researching topics that interest me. So that will be the focus of another talk at some point in the future. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this one. I hope it had taught you something about wills.